So I would like to welcome you again at our afternoon session. This time we have a kind of surprise, a new type of presentation, since there were certain complications with bringing Caecile Varslav Pedersen here in the last moment. We decided to include her online. Cecil, I hope it will function. There will be some improvisation needed, but I think we are all well prepared for that. Cecile Varslav Pedersen works on post-Kantian thought, especially the ethical, existential, and political aspects of Hegel's and Kierkegaard's philosophy. Her research examines 19th century conceptions of modernity and subjectivity, and the migration of religious concepts into secular moral discourse. She also has an interest in feminist philosophy and holds a postdoc position at University of Southampton in the UK and PhD degree in the New School for Social Research in New York City. So it's my honor and pleasure to give the word to Cecile Varslav Pedersen, who will give the talk just as the movements of the winds prevent the seas from stagnation. Another look at Hegel and war. Please, the word is yours.
Thank you so much. Yes, so I want to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me, and I'm really, really sorry that I can't be in Ljubljana in person, but I unfortunately can't travel at the moment. So I'm very grateful that you have chosen to allow me to present online instead. Yes, as was just mentioned, I'm going to present a paper on Hegel and war, and it springs from some work I have been doing for years now on the meaning of sacrifice in Hegel. So it's inspired from that. And I'm excited to hear what questions and thoughts you may have about this topic. Okay, so I'm just gonna share my slides with you. Yes, can you see them? Okay, so I start out. So despite his famous defense, and as you can hear, my voice is not too great. I just got over a bad cold, so I hope it will survive throughout the presentation. Despite his famous defense of peace in the Perpetual Peace, Kant admits in the Critique of Judgment that, this is the quote, oh sorry, even war has something sublime about it if it's carried out in an orderly way and with respect for the sanctity of citizens' rights. A prolonged peace, on the other hand, tends to make prevalent a merely commercial spirit, and along with it, base selfishness, cowardice, and softness, and to debase a way of thinking of that people. So in this paper, I want to reflect on Hegel's appropriation of this Kantian idea, and specifically, I want to examine Hegel's idea that war can function as a sort of resuscitation of the spirit of a community. Because in several works, Hegel argues that when individuals are forced to risk and sacrifice their lives for the sake of the community or the state, they're detached from their private pursuits, such as accumulation of wealth and property, or their individual self-interest, and they're directed instead towards the collective values of the community. And of course, as many of you already know, the issue of war in Hegel is notorious, because in the philosophy of right, he claims that citizens must sacrifice their lives for the sake of the survival of the state, if this is necessary, and that war has a necessary ethical moment. So Ido Geiger, who's an Israeli scholar, has demonstrated convincingly, I think, that with the exception of Karl Popper, virtually all interpreters in the last 5 decades holds that Hegel's writings on war should be taken as descriptive and not prescriptive. So the passage which refers to the ethical moment of war in the philosophy of right, describe how war has already functioned in existing states. And it's only in this retrospective sense that war has had a necessary ethical value. However, Geiger also argues that I can just stop sharing again. Geiger also argues that the group of interpretations that argue that Hegel's claims on war are descriptive offers no way, this is a quote, no way to preserve the higher ethical values of the state without waging war. So we may still, despite this, be worried that both about Hegel's rejection of liberalism, because the individual must sacrifice his life for the state, and about whether Hegel still in some ways glorifies war. And the idea of my argument is to counter such worries. So in what follows, I'm going to argue that for Hegel, war is significant not in itself, but because of what it reveals. And war, Hegel invites us to see, brings about a meta-reflection on the highest values of a given community, and first and foremost, the value of freedom. So I claim, following Geiger, that Hegel does not take war to be constitutive or creating the highest values of the community. And this also means, I suggest, that there are other ways for communities to reflect on their highest values than by means of war, according to Hegel. And finally, I'm going to argue that the kind of freedom that war reveals is only negative freedom, while the positive social freedom and what Hegel in the philosophy of right calls patriotism is constituted in peacetime. So my paper has 3 sections. So first, I'm going to consider what Hegel takes to be the problem with liberalism or bourgeois liberalism. Secondly, I'm going to compare the experience of fear in war to the experience of fear of death, which the servant in the phenomenology of spirit, which I'm sure you all know, experiences. And finally, I'm going to discuss the implications of the revelatory properties that Hegel ascribes to war. And I'm going to discuss whether we can reveal the same things without war, like by other means than war. Okay. And I should also mention that Hegel's statements about war are reiterated in different variations, both in his very early essay, which has a very long title, but usually it's in the Anglophone world, it's just called the Natural Law Essay from 1802 and 3. And in his early system drafts, there are also from the same period and the years immediately following, there are also some comments on war. Then in the Phenomenology of Spirit, which you are probably well aware in its sections on ancient Greek ethical life. And then, of course, most famously in the Philosophy of Right. But in this paper, I'm going to build my account primarily on the argument in the early natural law essay. And then at the very end, I'm going to return to the philosophy of right. Okay, so I start with my first section on the problem of bourgeois liberalism. So one of the points of departure of Hegel's account of war is the problem of decadence, which in its modern form is associated with bourgeois liberalism. In the natural law essay, Hegel discusses the problem in terms of a critique of atomism. So atomism is the idea that society essentially consists of a conglomerate of discrete and self-sufficient individuals. And in the natural law essay, in order to critique atomism, Hegel introduces his very famous and central concept of Sittlichkeit, or ethical life, which is in this context an alternative to what he calls empiricist and formalistic accounts of natural law, which are both based on the principle that the individual has higher value than the community. So both of these sets of theories are examples of atomism. So in Natural Law and other early manuscripts, Hegel expresses his worry about the preoccupation with individual needs and a reification of basic needs into more complex cultural desires, which are shaped by market economy. So these needs form a system of independence, since, as Hegel writes, for the totality of his need, no one is independent. The problem is, nevertheless, that the individual, when she's preoccupied with her own needs, can lose sight of this dependence and be led to the illusion that she's wholly independent of the social whole of the community. And this gives rise, in turn, to what Hegel in the early writings called positivity, which is the opposite of negativity, which he thinks is something good and productive. Positivity can be explained as the kind of ossification or spiritual death of social institutions. So Hegel presupposes that in times of peace, we tend to get immersed in everyday personal concerns, and that these concerns come to seem like, quote, an independent power, like a self-standing structure with absolute rather than relative value. So to avoid this, Hegel argues, human desire in its reified form of bourgeois property relation has to be curbed. And we'll see that war sacrifice is a way of limiting individual need from seeming too all-important. Okay, so I now turn to the central passage of the at least one of the very central passages of the Natural Law essay, which, and it's very interesting, I think, that immediately after he introduces his very famous idea here in an early version of Sittlichkeit or ethical life, Hegel makes a much discussed proclamation about sacrifice and war. So Hegel writes, the individual proves his oneness with the people in a negative sense and in an unambiguous manner only by incurring the danger of death. War preserves the ethical health of peoples in their indifference to determinate things. It prevents the latter from hardening and the people from becoming habituated to them. Just as the movements of the winds preserves the seas from stagnation, which a permanent calm would produce, and which a permanent or indeed perpetual peace, which referring of course to Kant, would produce among people. So we can see here in the passage that this vivid seas and winds metaphor indicates that war is able to revive and stir up an ossified form of life. So in war, the social bond of the people is strengthened and vitalized because war detaches individuals from their particular self-interested projects and property. So I think that's what determinate things refer to here. So we can also say war defamiliarizes individuals from the habits they develop in peacetime. And if we look at Hegel's critique of a very beautiful slide. If we look at Hegel's critique of 17th century contract theory in natural law, in the Natural Law essay, we can get a better understanding of how the problem of excessive individualism leads Hegel to make these striking claims about war. So according to the Hobbesian version of contract theory, which Hegel examines in the Natural Law, he writes, quote, the being of the individual has primary and supreme value. So according to Hobbes, when the individual escapes the state of nature and agrees to submit herself to a sovereign by entering the social contract in exchange for the security, it is in exchange for the security of peace of civilization. So peace in turn allows the individual to pursue her own self-interest, such as acquiring wealth and property. So if we follow Leo Strauss's reading, because the entire point of agreeing to the terms of the social contract, the entire point of wanting to leave the state of nature and sacrifice one's individual freedom, was to secure the survival of the individual. For Hobbes, it would be logically inconsistent to ask the individual to risk her life for the community in war. So according to Leo Strauss, of course, despite, I picked the picture of the Leviathan, Despite the kind of Hobbes' appeal to an unrestricted sovereign, Lévi-Strauss sees Hobbes as also the father of liberalism because of this claim that Hobbes does not say the state cannot ask the individuals to sacrifice him or herself in war, because that would be inconsistent. So despite Hobbes' conclusion that a sovereign is the only justified form of political authority, his primary intention is liberal in nature. The purpose of society is to secure the survival and the opportunity of the individual. And Hegel agrees vehemently with this Hobbesian line of argument. He is critical of what he takes to be contract theory's valuation of individual security over freedom. So ironically, then we could say that the highest value for liberalism on Hegel's account is not liberty, it is security. So for him, the basic analytic category of political thought is not the atomistic individual, but as mentioned, Sittlichkeit, or what he calls in this period of his work, he calls it the absolute ethical totality, in which the individual always finds herself. For this reason, Hegel further claims that for a community to be wholly alive, in spiritual terms at least, it must be committed to values that exceed the interest of each individual. And in other words, ethical life is more than the system of needs. So in contrast to Hobbes, Hegel therefore argues that the state can ask the individual to sacrifice herself in war. And the specific war Hegel has in mind is very different, of course, from maybe not of course anymore, but it's very different from many of today's militarized conflicts and proxy wars. So he's thinking of peoples fighting other peoples in their own territory with the risk of losing their freedom by being enslaved or occupied. And perhaps with Ukraine and with Gaza, we're seeing some of these phenomena occur again. So war for Hegel is first and foremost an existential threat. So to repeat my point, Hegel envisions war as a bulwark against the ossification of social institution. War has the ability of revealing the individual's dependence on the social whole, insofar as the fear of death directs individuals away from private self-interested values and towards higher common values. And in the case of the soldier who actively risks his life, he proves to himself and to the community that collective values are more important than individual pursuits of wealth, prestige, etc. And the collective value which Hegel has foremost in his mind is, not surprisingly, the value of freedom. So I now go to my second section, that fear of death and the experience of freedom. So one way of explaining how war sacrifice can reveal the value of freedom is to look ahead at how Hegel describes the fear of death experienced by the servant in the famous passages on the dialectics of the master and the servant in the self-consciousness chapter of the phenomenology of spirit. Probably the most famous passages of Hegel's entire corpus. And as you may recall, on Hegel's account, the servant experiences the fear of death, that the master will kill him. And in a particular passage, Hegel describes fear as the experience that all of the servants' particular concerns, desires, individual self-interest, and values lose their prior appearance of necessity. So he writes, the servile consciousness was not driven with anxiety about just this or that matter, nor did he have anxiety about just this or that moment. Rather, it had anxiety about its entire essence. It felt the fear of death, the absolute master. In that feeling, it had inwardly fallen into dissolution, trembled in its depth, and all that was fixed within it had been shaken loose. And Hegel further writes, quote, that all durable existence becomes absolutely fluid. So here, as in the natural law essay, we see that where he compared war and the fear of death in war to a wind which stirs up waves. We can see again here uses a water metaphor, like Physikwerden, all durable existence becomes absolutely fluid. And this metaphor, I think not coincidentally, but maybe it is, but it's similar to the other disorientation that opens Descartes' second meditation. If you maybe you remember this, it feels as if I have fallen unexpectedly into a deep whirlpool which tumbles me around so that I can neither stand on the bottom nor swim to the top. So perhaps Hegel had this passage in mind when writing about the servant sphere, since the servant, like Descartes, is about to discover an Archimedean point, namely the cogito, in the midst of this all-dissolving existential fear. And in the phenomenology, in a sort of similar way, what stands out in the midst of the liquefying fear is, Hegel writes, the simple essence of subconsciousness, absolute negativity, pure being for itself. So we can read this experience as the self-discovery of freedom, and specifically negative freedom. Freedom as negativity is an individual capacity to abstract oneself from one's immediate natural desires. And Hegel further argues, quote, that the individual who has not risked its life may admittedly be recognized as a person, but it has not achieved the truth of being recognized as a self-sufficient self-consciousness. So by this, I think we can see that risking one's life or radically fearing death is a transformative experience which reveals the negative freedom of the subject. So if we go back to natural law, Hegel argues that, Hegel argues that war sacrifice is able to bring about a recognition of freedom. In war, the fear of death and total annihilation reveals not only the relativity of individual pursuits and activities, but also the freedom of ethical life as such. The understanding that ethical life is more than just a conglomerate of individuals preoccupied with satisfying their own needs and desires. And through the sacrifice, the individual soldier proves to himself and to the community that he's more than a living being. He's more also than a self-interested living being, because he is free from nature or from particular self-interest. And that ethical life is more than a natural species. It's a free community, not just a natural community. Okay, so now to my final section. So I've tried to show that according to Hegel, war sacrifice reveals that without the political community, the individual's private pursuits are null, cannot exist, cannot be realized. Yet, however forceful this line of reasoning is, Hegel's account also seems to have the, at least in modern Western eyes, paradoxical implication that the highest moment of the individual is his own self-sacrifice in war. So by this I mean that the most admirable thing, according to Hegel, that an individual citizen can do for the community is to die for its sake, since this is what displays the freedom of the community. And furthermore, I think it's also not completely implausible to insist that certain passages indicate Hegel's fascination with the intensity of war in its sheer chaotic destruction. So if you look at some of his early system drafts from 1802 and 3, there are these fantastic passages where he describes this ecstatic debauchery and wastefulness that war creates, where everything you imagine everyone is out in the street and almost partying and spending all their money because their life form is threatened as such. And indeed, the passage quoted above from the natural law essay, the central passage, may be read as if the sacrificing soldier is enacting a kind of secular existential drama, which is otherwise not present in the modern world, through which he's able to escape the gray everydayness of peacetime. So we may think that what Hegel is saying is that only in the throes of ecstatic fear of death can people feel genuinely and genuinely alive and free in spiritual terms. So I think such reading would be mistaken, although I recognize there's some evidence supporting them. And I will end my paper with giving 2 reasons for why I think it's a mistaken reading. So first, and surprisingly, as we have seen, the most central feature of war for Hegel is that it brings about a form of collective self-understanding. But we can ask, so what exactly is happening in this shift when the community starts reflecting on itself when its life is threatened? Is it the case that the highest values of the community or a kind of collective subject is constituted through war? As I read it, Hegel is not claiming that, he's merely claiming that war reveals what is already the case, namely that individuals depend on the community. And this community is not constituted through war. Rather, war reveals the social bond that makes up the community. So one piece of evidence for this claim, which I can mention here, is that when we look at Hegel's early system drafts from the same period of natural law, we can see that Hegel's, which I think is very interesting, Hegel's treatment of war is placed immediately before the sections on art, religion, and science or philosophy. So the account of war is placed immediately before the account of absolute spirit. And in these writings, Hegel defines absolute spirit as spirit attaining, quote, a view or an Anschauung of what spirit is itself as itself. Another common way of, in more current Anglophone scholarship, of defining absolute spirit is the set of practices and activities with which a community collectively reflects on its own highest values. So Pippin, for instance, Robert Pippin would define it like that. So if we combine these 2 definitions of absolute spirit, we see that this sort of meta-reflection on the highest values, and especially the value of freedom, is exactly what Hegel claims is the most significant aspect of war. So if we phrase this point a bit polemically, we could say, okay, maybe then we could say that war is a 4th type of absolute spirit along with art, religion, and philosophy. So this controversial suggestion would, on the other hand, also imply that there would be other mediums for reflecting on the highest value than war. So war is not necessary. It's not a necessary condition for communal self-reflection on the highest values, and for the community to experience itself as free, although it may be a sufficient condition for this kind of meta-reflection, because war has, and Hegel is clearly also saying that war has fulfilled this function in specific historical forms of life. Okay, and secondly, war also prompts us to clarify Hegel's understanding of freedom. So as mentioned, war reveals that ethical life exceeds nature, that it cannot be reduced to the system of needs, and thus war reveals freedom as a negation of nature. I will get to this quotation just in a bit. Despite the terrible violence of war, Hegel insists war sacrifice shows us important things about ourselves. That although we are nature, we're not just nature, and we have commitments that are higher than our own personal self-interest. However, this is not all that Hegel takes freedom to be. So I cannot here, like at the very end, give a full account of Hegel's idea of social and positive freedom, but I will end with a brief remark on the philosophy of right. So in the philosophy of right, Hegel introduces a very noteworthy and interesting distinction, which is not explicit in the natural law essay, which emphasizes the social aspect of freedom. So here he distinguishes between being willing to sacrifice oneself in war, so having a disposition to sacrifice oneself, and actually sacrificing oneself. So he calls this disposition for self-sacrifice patriotism. And patriotism is habituated or internalized trust that my interest is also the other's interest. And if this trust is present, Hegel writes, I am free. So if I'm willing to risk my life and confront near death, even if it's just potentially, then I'm free, he's saying here. So I think in the philosophy of right, it's very clear that freedom is not constituted in the violent self-sacrifice in war, or through the fear of death in war, although such sacrifice may be required in extreme circumstances. But rather, Hegel writes, and this is the quote on the slide, that it is the same consciousness which is tried and tested in ordinary life that underlies the willingness to make extraordinary efforts. So as I read it, Hegel showed that war makes visible what before was invisible and kind of receding it all in all its ordinariness, namely the social bond that makes community cohere and which makes possible the freedom of the individual in the final instance. And thus he's not defending sacrifice or war without qualification by any means. Thank you for listening.
So, thank you, Cecile, for what has been really extremely interesting and challenging presentation. I personally would have a lot of things to discuss with you. So I'm really sorry that you're not here. But let us. Are there any questions? Questions? Okay, then I would start. So, as I said, there are many things that you said, and on many we could enter into discussion. I completely agree on the parallel between the dialectics of master and servant in the phenomenology of spirit, and the historical or importance of war in the relation between the states. However, my first question would be, what is the exact nature of this comparison? Because if we read the master-servant dialectics, it's not only about being prepared to die, but it's being prepared to live. Because there are many sequences, and in the first one, they both die, basically. In this way, they prove that they are free, but that leads to no stable result. And if we then go at the second, let's say, clash, we see that one has proven himself to be ready to die and becomes the master, and the other hasn't proven to be ready to die. He actually accepts the subordinated position. So it seems that the experience of the war, and it is the position of the servant that is of, let's say, developmental important. The phenomenology of spirits proceeds on the side of the servant. So precisely the one who made a step backward, the one who wasn't prepared to die, So, what are the implications for the importance of war in, steering the water that could be otherwise ossified? Other thing would be that you mentioned that the present day wars are not as they used to be apart from Gaza and Ukraine. Because in the present day we somehow learned to domesticate war, because in United States it was we used to be in the war for 20 years, 40 years, but the people got used to it. Why? Because it is not a conscript army that wages war, but a professional army that is a kind of sub element of the society that in a way shields the nation and the civil society from the war. So do you think that from that point of view, the wars of professional armies cannot count as wars in Hegel's sense, or that in Hegel's view, professional army is a kind of conceptual monster? And third question, I like this idea very much about war as being part of the absolute spirit, because fourth type of absolute spirit besides religion and philosophy. So art, religion, philosophy, war. This is kind of odd community. But I think that it touches upon something in Hegel, and this is not only fourth type of community, but the question of the relation between objective spirit and absolute spirit, and more precisely the relation between universal spirit that is being realized in history and the forms of absolute spirit. And in this case, it's not obviously it's not only the war, but also the peace and patriotism that enter into the determination of universal spirit. So, what is then the relation between universal spirit and forms of absolute spirit? Just to begin with.
I don't know if I can give a full answer to the first question here. Like, so how does the parallel, what are the implications of the parallel between the passages on the servant and war? And I think in part because I have a kind of technical, exegetical answer to that. I think there are different moments of the servant. And of course, it is true that in other sense, the servant is also for Hegel someone who has also we follow Koshev's very famous reading. There is a sense in which the servant can, it's only the servant who can sublimate its fear or do something productive or do something to keep the experience of fear of death and keep the experience of freedom present to it in some non-liquid form, which can be a step to a further form of spirit. And the servant who cannot do that, I think, is actually would be comparable to the bourgeois liberal who does not want to sacrifice his life. And Hegel says something. He defines the bourgeois in the philosophy of spirit of right as the one who does not want to sacrifice, and he says that is a form of slavery, and that's not Hegel who came up with this idea. It's a very it's an idea with a long history in a trajectory in the history of philosophy. So we find it in Plato already that choosing serfdom over risking one's life is what proves the slavishness of the slave. Hannah Arendt writes about Plato. So I think the parallel here, which is if it has to work, is only the fear of death, like the experience of the fear of death in that moment, and not so much here the servitude or the slave. Because then, of course, what the slave does next in order to we can say solidate or solidify the experience of fear is that it works, right? It starts working on the thing, and this is how it again experiences itself as free. And later in the phenomenology, this is, I'm sorry for all of you who are not Hegelians, very technical, but later in the phenomenology, he also describes the war as a kind of work when he describes the Greek prolis. So here I think we have to focus on focus on the fear of death as an experience of freedom. We have to just focus on that, and that's what's holds the parallel to war and also the parallel to Descartes' second meditation. The second question, I don't know what I quite think about it, and maybe because I'm not completely sure that Hegel knows what he thinks about, like whether a professional army would not we can say a form of life or form of society that has a professional army would not be war of this kind. I would not be able to generate the kind of experience I have tried to describe, because he says sometimes, okay, societies that has a military class where only a specific class goes to war and sacrifice their life, that this has the effect that the rest of society does not experience, like the bourgeois who just sit at home and read about the war from the newspaper. They do not get to experience this transformative existential experience as the soldier. And other times it is, especially the early writings, I read it as if he says, okay, the entire people is fierce for its lives, fierce for its entire form of existence. So they're all transformed, and I kind of see both. So I think the central point, and also what has been, that's what I'm trying to emphasize, what's been a bit overlooked in the literature, is this question of the fear of death. That's the thing about war that brings about the transformation. And the third question, maybe could I have you repeat that?
Basically,
Or you can ask if you want to move on. You can do that.
any other questions? Maybe we can return. Yes.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. On this topic of discussion that you were having between you two on the polemical existence of a professional army, and the difficulties to determine if war in an Hegelian sense would exist within such conditions. I would like to ask if this is not already pretty much answered in the philosophy of right, especially taking into account the one point that you have made just now and very clearly, which is, I think, very important, that is the centrality of the existential threat. And Hegel, precisely in the paragraph 326, says that it can be effectively an standing army or a professional class of defenders of the state, but the existence of an ethical nuance in war does not come from the existence or absence of this class, but from the fact that in a limit moment, the very independence and existence of the state in the Hegelian sense, in an ethical state that preserves the concrete freedom of the individual merge with universality, like this is at stake. He says that even though there is a professional class of soldiers, if the entire state has thus become an armed power, like he's even a conquering power with a professional army, and sorry, Yes, but insofar as the state as such and its independence are at risk, duty requires all citizens to rally to its defense. So even though a professional army exists, like in the most extreme situation, this doesn't even imply anything, because the existential threat would be so large that everyone would will fit this threat of immediate destruction, this threat of existential threat that you, I think, very very correctly pointed out. So the thing is, wouldn't you consider that more or less this situation would be mm, responded in their own philosophy of rights, according to this?
Yes, so I think, thank you very much for pointing out this passage. So what I think it's of course right that he would call, so for me the question is not so much whether we would call it war or not, even if there is a military class. I was more into, because I've been very interested in the meaning of sacrifice. I have been interested in this quote that he says the definition of the bourgeois is the one who does not want to sacrifice itself or himself or herself. So that is part, I think, of his critique of liberalism. And so even if he says, the whole population experiences the fear and threat of death, and everyone is, of course, that's my whole point, everyone is kind of directed away from the individual small and petty pursuits. Yes, there's still something about the bourgeois class, or someone who per definitions couldn't maybe not go to war, that he's criticizing. And it's actually also a passage which Carl Schmitt quotes directly in, I think, the concept of the political, which he of course uses in a kind of different argument. So this was mainly, so I'm interested in it in order for understanding what effects, or its transformative effect, the sacrifice itself has. So there, of course, perhaps also, if we take it to also modern day context, there's a difference between living in a country that's attacked and fearing for your life, fearing for your future, in a kind of more abstract sense, and then being on the battlefield, risking your life, perhaps. And it's also interesting, I think, to think about whether also some of these more modern types of war has the same existential effects. I guess American wars, such as the Iraq War, for instance, was definitely an attempt by the politicians to, we can say, fabricate this kind of experience, or this kind of question about who are we. Like, it's supposed to reveal something about who we are. That of course we go to war, or that 9/11 was an attack on our highest values and who we are, even if it's not a territorial invasion by any means.
Thank you. Any other questions? Huh? One shot, and then I will have one very, very short as well.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. So I have a short question, namely on the relation between war and habit. Something you haven't mentioned, but the way you described it. So first we have isolated individual, um, that is not only atomary and self-enclosed, living her own small private life, but the passages you quoted suggest that there's also kind of some dulling of life present in them, namely a kind of mechanism of self-feeling, the one gets accustomed to, and Hegel describes this as habit. And then we have war that makes explicit individuals' co-determination on the social bond. This is one point you raised, and I'm interested. Could we also say that, how habit functions here, and could we also say that war is also liberation of this dull mechanism of self-feeling of the very idea that constitutes habit? Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is yes, a very good question, and also something I would like to think more about in the future. Yes, I thought when I read these passages on war, it's very interesting because there's so much research now on second nature in Hegel and habit in nature, and this is war is kind of a dehabitation, as I described it, or as a waking up from the dullness, as you called it, of habits. So also maybe, so kind of the definition of second nature is that it's invisible, or we don't see our habits in everyday lives. And in war, we can say we at least. I mean, there's one, the critique of bourgeois liberalism. We become aware that of the relative value of what we in our everyday lives think are so important, like our getting more money or getting a better job, and all of that seems like not very important when our lives are threatened. And then there may be also that we become aware of these, that we are habitual creatures in the first place. But my argument is then that we don't need war to do this. We can just we can also maybe do it through art and religion, and especially probably Hegel would say the best way would be philosophy, right? To reflect on our habits. Because of course the argument is a bit, I mean, not that we need to be advocates or defend Hegel, but the dangerous dark argument, if we follow it that way, would be to say that, we are only fully self-conscious, or we are only like a kind of vitalistic argument that we are only fully alive, and we only fully break with this dullness of habit when we go to war or risk our lives. So this is, yes, in this paper, what I've tried to see that, okay, there are other ways of reading Hegel which are more sympathetic than to go there.
Okay, thank you. I promised one more question, very short one, because I cannot help to think about this parallel between the war and the master-servant dialectics. Because basically, Hegel, master is the one who is fearless, who is ready to die, to sacrifice his life. On the other hand, we have servant, whose basic intention is basically, I would say, how to survive, and who is even ready to accept the burden of subjectivation to the master, to the universal. And what is interesting is that usually we side with the master. We see in him, the one who courageously braves all the dangers, and even if it puts herself into dangers of that, sustained it. But no, Hegel sides with the servant. His sympathies are on the side of the servants, and I think that we should provide an interpretation of its importance of the war that would somehow respect that side of Hegel's comparison. And could that be then that if we read the war from the side of the servant, the one who wants to survive, even under, let's say, dear conditions, even under dear conditions for her personal freedom, could that be formulated in a way that the goal is the identification with the ethical community, meaning the state? So this is what is produced by going into the war.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to think a bit more about it, because I think with the servant, as I also said before, I mean, a better parallel would be the later passages on war in the spirit chapter, right? Because there he lays it out kind of very transparently, the structure he's imagining. But with the servant, I mean, at different moments of the servant, of course, we must imagine that the master at first, or the self-consciousness who goes into the war of life and death, is someone who actually experiences himself as free, right? Exactly, experiences that freedom is a higher value than life. And then as I read the passages, which is of course very complex, the servant has different options. Like he can keep caring about his own life as a slave and not learn anything, or he can embrace this experience of fear of death and then sublimate it into work. And work is a different theory of freedom. I think the servant who keeps I'm just repeating myself. The servant who keeps being preoccupied with his own immediate natural needs, which is also the stop and serve. I think also Martin has written a paper about this. Maybe he has something to say. That is a servant which is not who Hegel does not side with at all, and which is not going to go anywhere, and is comparable to the bourgeois class in the philosophy, right? And I think you would need a more complicated story about war as work to make, and work as a sublimation of the fear of death to make full parallel with the servant and war. Does it make sense at all?
Yes. Hendrik. Okay, we will going to thank you for your speech and hope to see you next time here in Ljubljana.
Thank you very much for having me.